Good afternoon. You're watching the Debka File, a weekly roundup of exclusive news, insight, and analysis from the Middle East, broadcast to you live from the heart of the region. Coming up on the program today, Iran is the top priority for the Netanyahu-Trump talks. U.S. leaves chlorine attack on Ghouta to the UN Security Council. Egypt's first ever airstrike over the Nile Delta. Lebanon's upcoming elections. Saudi Crown Prince due in Washington. Putin's new weapons won't save him from his allies in Syria. And now to our top stories. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will be meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump at the White House. The main questions at the meeting will be, what form should the Israeli military take action amidst the escalating Iranian and Hezbollah military presence in Syria and Lebanon? Netanyahu spoke to reporters before his departure.
אני חושב שזו נסיעה מאוד חשובה, ואני אפגש עם ידיד גדול של ישראל וידיד גדול אישי שלי, נשיא ארצות הברית דונלד טראמפ. אני אודה לו קודם כל על ההחלטה ההיסטורית להעביר את שגרירות ארצות הברית לישראל ביום העצמאות, מתנה גדולה מאוד למדינה שלנו. ואני הולך לדון איתו על שורה של נושאים, אבל בראשם איראן. התוקפנות שלה, השאיפות הגרעיניות שלה, הפעולות האגרסיביות שלה במזרח התיכון בכלל ובגבולנו ממש, בכל גבולותינו. ואני הולך לדון איתו על שורה של נושאים, אבל בראשם איראן. התוקפנות שלה, השאיפות הגרעיניות שלה, הפעולות האגרסיביות שלה במזרח התיכון בכלל ובגבולנו ממש, בכל גבולותינו. אני חושב שהצורך להדוף את התוקפנות הזאת זה יעד משותף לנו ולמדינות אחרות באזור.
Meanwhile, Washington has put the issue of the nuclear deal with Iran on hold as the Europeans work on a new formula. They've been advised to come up with better terms before the next deadline in May. Otherwise, Trump will withhold certification. They're also trying to satisfy Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who refuses to consider any changes to the deal. The Palestinian issue is also on hold. An attempt to lay out a peace plan could happen in the next several weeks when two allies will be visiting the White House. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in March and the UAE Crown Prince Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed in April. Their rival, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, the Emir of Qatar, will also be visiting in April when U.S. diplomats will attempt to resolve their feud. The downgrading of Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner's security clearance influences the project he leads with Greenblatt and U.S. Ambassador David Friedman for promoting an Israeli-Palestinian peace accord. The Pentagon issued a statement that the U.S. has not seen any evidence yet of the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian government in eastern Ghouta. This is a direct contradiction of the reports circulated by U.S. sources in the past 2 weeks. The U.S. also asked the UN Security Council to set up a new inquiry of chemical weapons attacks in Syria after reports of chlorine use in eastern Ghouta. United Nations Under-Secretary General Jeffrey Feltman responded to these attacks.
The airstrike, shelling, and ground offensives continue. There are even reports of yet another chlorine gas attack. What we need is implementation of 2401, and that is not happening.
Deputy U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Kelly Currie, reprimanded Russia for its role in the declining situation in Ghouta.
Since we adopted Resolution 2401, Russia has announced a daily 5-hour humanitarian pause in the aerial bombing of civilians in eastern Ghouta. This is cynical, callous, and in flagrant defiance of the demands of 2401. The cessation of hostilities is for at least 30 days, every day, all day. Russia does not get to unilaterally rewrite the terms of the resolution they negotiated and they sat here and voted for. We know what Iran, Syria, and the Assad regime are doing because they have done exactly the same thing before. This is the same playbook they used for Aleppo in 2016. Once again, we, including Russia, demanded in this Security Council chamber that Assad stop the bombing. And yet Russia, Iran, and Assad continue their attacks, defying the wishes of this council and the international community. Because we've been through this before, we know what Russia will say today. They will say that there are terrorists in eastern Ghouta, so the Assad regime can bomb as ferociously and indiscriminately as it wants and kill as many civilians as it wants.
With us to discuss these issues is Dr. Martin Sherman of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Do you believe Israel can prevent Iran and Hezbollah from establishing a dominant presence in Syria and Lebanon?
Well, I think it's very unwise to predict in this area. I don't think that any so-called expert of the region would have predicted the situation that is emerging at the moment, with possible tensions between the US and Russia, with possible tensions between Turkey and the US. So the situation is very difficult to predict, and the potential for unintended consequences is huge. But on a specific issue, I wrote a column last Friday entitled "The Perils of Postponing Preemption." And I think that if Israel wants to choose its preferred strategy, it should look back at its history and look at the triumph of 1967 and the trauma of 1973. In 1967, they preempted and won a dramatic victory. And in 1973, they hesitated and waited. When deterrence failed, they had to respond to an attack. And I think it would be very, very dangerous for Israel to allow the other side to choose the moment for attack, because you have to be incredibly naive to believe that the Hezbollah, under Iranian auspices, is amassing over 100,000 rockets just for show. The working assumption must be that they're going to use them sometime. And the question is, will Israel allow them to choose the moment, or will Israel preempt?
We just heard Netanyahu saying that the need to rebuff this aggression is a common goal for Israel and other countries in the region. Do you agree with this statement?
Well, the short answer is yes. I think anyone who views Shia hegemony in the region, would view this as a negative development, and therefore would agree with Netanyahu's assessment.
What do you think will be the best outcome of the Netanyahu-Trump talks for Israel?
Well, I think this is a very taxing time for Netanyahu, because he certainly had very many foreign policy triumphs with India, withstanding the very hostile Obama administration, and now has a much more friendly administration in the US. He's, I think, masterful appearance before the EU. So he's had these great foreign policy triumphs and this very harrowing situation back at home. So I'm not quite sure how free he is to act there, but I would say that he should aim for getting Trump to put his ultimate deal on the back burner, because this is a deal which obviously the Palestinians and the Israelis will not accept. And it's a sure recipe for going nowhere. So I think the best thing that he could do is to persuade Trump to put the ultimate deal on the back burner and try and get him to stiffen as much as possible his attitude towards the Iranians.
Why do you think Netanyahu toned down his rhetoric regarding Iran prior to meeting with Trump?
Well, I'm not sure what that assessment is based on. I certainly haven't noticed it myself, but if it is true, I think it just may be a diplomatic gesture towards his host in Washington, not to put too much pressure on him.
Is it possible that Trump's meeting with Netanyahu could lead nowhere today?
No, I don't think it will lead nowhere, but I don't think it will improve Netanyahu's domestic position. I think his domestic rivals are not at all impressed by his foreign policy successes. So I don't think whatever the outcome is in Washington will influence the vehemence of the investigations against him here.
Do you think what happens at the meeting could potentially impact how he is viewed back at home?
No, I don't think so. I think his supporters will see this as an indication of their support for him, and his opponents will see it as irrelevant.
That's Dr. Martin Sherman. Thank you so much for your insight today.
Thank you for having me.
The Egyptian Air Force has bombed 6 terrorist targets in Sinai and the Nile Delta. Egyptian military spokesman Colonel Tamar Rifai did not specify which areas were struck in the 2 regions or which terrorist organizations were targeted. Debka file military sources report that the Egyptian military's expansion of its counter-terror campaign from the Sinai desert into northern Egypt is proof of the rising threat posed by ISIS and the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. The Nile Delta has a population of 38 million who are living in Alexandria and Cairo. President el-Sisi approved this measure despite its inevitable fallout, so that he could lower the terrorism concerns which have been threatening his regime before Egypt goes to the polls later this month. In the past 4 years, since seizing power from the Muslim Brotherhood's President Mohamed Morsi, his track record has diminished, and now his political status is at stake. On February 9th, Comprehensive Operation Sinai 2018 was launched to confront terrorist activity in the Sinai Delta and west of the Nile Valley. The military spokesman reported that 16 troops and 10 terrorists have been killed, and 245 have been detained. Amnesty International has issued a statement accusing the Egyptian Air Force of using U.S.-supplied Mk-118 cluster munitions in North Sinai. The Lebanon polls are predicting a parliamentary majority for the Hezbollah-led pro-Iranian March 8th alliance in Lebanon's general elections in May. The alliance is led by two Lebanese Shiite parties, Hezbollah and Amal. The polls were secretly held by Western and Arab intelligence services. They also discovered a political deal for keeping the current prime minister, Saad Hariri, in office, despite the fact that Sunni bloc, which he leads, will have the minority status in parliament. Hariri received a message from Saudi leaders to explain his failure to prevent Iran's takeover in Beirut. He arrived last Wednesday, but by that time it was too late. Hariri and Nasrallah agreed that Hariri will be confirmed as prime minister by a parliamentary majority, although his cabinet will be made up of Hezbollah and pro-Iranian loyalists. Last November, Hariri was invited to Riyadh to meet with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, where he and his family were put on house arrest. He was released after 2 weeks, but only after giving the Saudi treasury $7 billion, a huge portion of his family fortune. After arriving in Beirut, Hariri forged a political pact with the pro-Hezbollah president Michel Aoun. Debka Middle East sources report that their pact is strong enough to predetermine the post-election power structure in Beirut. After he retires, Aoun will be followed by his cousin, Lebanese Foreign Minister Gibran Bassil, head of the Free Patriotic Movement. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson believed that Lebanon was a lost cause when he visited Beirut on February 15th. Tillerson warned Lebanese leaders that Hezbollah's growing involvement in regional conflicts threaten their country's security. Tillerson and Acting Assistant Secretary David Satterfield continue to mediate the disputes between Lebanon and Israel regarding Block 9, Israel's security wall. Block 9 involves the gas exploration boundaries off the Mediterranean shores. In regards to the border wall, Lebanon will be questioning 13 points along the border where they say the IDF outpost has entered its territory. Israel is determined to continue with the project, which could last for the next several months. For Israel, the military situation across the northern border has become increasingly threatening. The Islamic Republic regime in Tehran can now access Israel from 4 directions: Syria, Lebanon, the Gaza Strip, and the eastern Mediterranean oil and gas fields. The Ayatollahs could have 4 ways to attack Israel if a war is in their strategic interests. The Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman will be traveling to Washington to meet President Trump at the White House after a major shakeup of its top military and defense chiefs. Debka weekly intelligence sources report that the Crown Prince hopes this new leadership will lead to a quick end to the Yemen war and is looking forward to 3 useful developments. First, the Iranian-backed Houthi insurgent forces, who began losing power after they murdered their ally, former President Ali Abdullah Saleh, in December of 2017 after his split from their movement. Second, deploying 10,000 Saudi troops to the Yemen battlefield. The group is currently undergoing intensive training in Pakistan. When they're ready to go to battle, bin Salman will count on them to destroy Houthi insurgency under the new commanders who were just appointed by King Salman. Finally, progress in the peace negotiations in Oman between U.S. diplomats and Houthi leaders. The Americans and Saudis were hoping to move the venue to Cairo, but Oman refused to let go and has persuaded the Houthi delegation to threaten to walk out if the talks are relocated. Putin is considering replacing Colonel General Alexander Zuraviev as his commander in Syria and restoring his predecessor, Colonel General Sergei Surovikin, head of Russian aerospace forces. He must face up to the death toll of the Russian troops in the Deir ez-Zor battle with the U.S. forces on February 7th, as well as the failure of Russia's advanced weapon systems on February 10th, when confronted by Israel's air raiders. Ahead of the Russian presidential elections, Putin spoke at a rally for a crowd of supporters. He claimed he would reverse the collapse of the Soviet Union.
У нас с вами ясные, понятные, благородные цели. Мы хотим сделать нашу страну яркой, устремленной вперед, в будущее. Потому что здесь жили наши предки, живем мы, живут наши дети и будут жить наши дети и наши внуки. Мы сделаем все для того, чтобы они были счастливы. Мы сделаем это, да? За нас и кроме нас этого не сделает никто. Но если мы это сделаем, то ближайшие десятилетия, весь 21 век пройдет под знаком наших ярких побед. Мы сделаем это, да?
Meanwhile, the Russians conclude they should never have given Turkish President Erdogan the green light for invading the North Syrian enclave of Afrin in January to destroy the Kurds. They calculated that by prohibiting his use of Turkish air power, they would keep him on a leash. Yet they were wrong, and Erdogan moved beyond Afrin into Idlib and eastern Aleppo, where he mobilized local militias for fighting Turkey's battles. He has now rounded up 30 militias who are either linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, the Salafi movement, Al-Qaeda, or former members of ISIS. The U.S. National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, declared on February 17th that now is the time for more forceful action to halt Iran's development of proxy armies in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. Last Tuesday in Washington, the top U.S. military commander in the Middle East said Iran was increasing the number of ballistic missiles in the region.
We know that Syria and North Korea are not the only rogue states developing, using, spreading dangerous weapons. Now is the time to address serious flaws in the Iran deal and counter Iran's destabilizing activities, including its development and proliferation of missiles and its support for terrorist proxies and militias that fuel destructive conflicts across the greater Middle East.
And now for a roundup of this week's regional headlines, the news in brief. Researchers have discovered the oldest tattoos in the world on two ancient Egyptian mummies. The male mummy has tattoos depicting wild animals, symbols of strength and bravery, while the female mummy has linear patterns, symbols of status and magical wisdom. The mummies date back to 3351 BC, before Egypt was unified by the first pharaoh. The research was led by scholars at Oxford University and was published in the Journal of Archaeological Science.
We have parallels for this imagery in the pottery of the time. Often in ceremonial scenes on pottery, we see people holding a very similar shaped instrument. And it's likely to represent a symbol of maybe status or maybe power. She has a crooked stave on the upper part of her arm, and on her shoulders she has a series of S's. And we have parallels for those in the iconography of pre-dynastic art. We think the curved line represents a stave, crooked stave, that's often depicted in ceremonial scenes, and it may be representing a special status, but also they're often depicting ritual scenes.
Israel has heightened its security in the Old City. There's now a watchtower at the main Damascus gate, which has garnered criticism from Palestinians who claim it is blocking their access. Israelis say the watchtower is necessary as the area is prone to terrorist attacks.
We know that here there are going to be terrorist attacks, and we know there are going to be future terrorist attacks. Whatever amount of security is necessary needs to be implemented here.
Palestinians claim it was constructed purposely to restrict their movement.
It's a military point to restrict the movement of Palestinians in their own city, and it completes, or it is part of a whole system of checkpoints that is built and designed strictly to prosecute, to slow down, and create an inhabitable environment for the Palestinians in their own city.
Mickey Rosenfeld, spokesman for the Israeli police, has disputed the claims.
Absolutely incorrect, absolutely inaccurate, and everybody who says that is using that against Israel. Very simple.
Egypt's top court has dismissed all outstanding legal challenges to a deal transferring 2 Red Sea islands to Saudi Arabia just one day before a visit by its crown prince. The plan to relinquish the islands to Riyadh, announced in 2016, became the target of political upheaval and legal action. The Supreme Court ruled that no other court would have jurisdiction, which blocked 2 opposing verdicts by the Supreme Administrative Court and the Court of Urgent Matters. Opponents claim Egypt's sovereignty over the islands dates back to the turn of the 20th century, before Saudi Arabia even was founded. Saudi officials say the islands belong to the kingdom and are only under Egyptian control because in 1950, Riyadh asked Cairo to protect them. That's it for this week's edition of the Debka File. We'll be back with you next week for exclusive news, insight, and analysis from the Middle East. Thanks for watching.